Hi everybody, my name is James Button. I'm a former journalist and these days one of the things I do is write for the Scanlon Foundation. And we're delighted to have so many people here today for this first follow-up event in our series of that follows our 2020 Mapping Social Cohesion, the launch of the Mapping Social Cohesion Report. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're all meeting now. I'm here in Melbourne on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to any other Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be present here today. Now, I know you're coming in from all over Australia, so why don't you write into the chat what land you're on, where you're coming into this event from. It'd be great to see in the chat where people are coming from. We've got a lot of people here today, and it's terrific to just see where people are coming from. I've got Yehan from Gubbi Gubbi land, Anika from Larrakia country in Darwin, that's terrific. Rashmi from Wurundjeri country, hi Rashmi. Anthea from Wurundjeri as well. So Turrbal, Yugera country, lots of different parts. Darugland, Sophie on Darugland. Please keep putting your place into the chat. So what we're here today to talk about the question of enduring discrimination in Australia. And as you know, in February, the Scanlon Foundation produced its annual Mapping Social Cohesion Report, and we launched that report last month. And so what we're going to talk about today is one aspect of that report, which is the prevalence of discrimination in Australia and how that might have changed over the past year with the COVID pandemic, but also how it might have changed over the past decade. We'll then explore the bigger picture, the extent and dynamics of structural discrimination and racism in Australia, and the role of communities, workplaces, and policy in changing that picture. We'll look at what former Race Discrimination Commissioner Tim Soutphommasane calls the enduring paradox of Australian multiculturalism, which is, as Tim sees it, that there is strong headline support for diversity, but clear evidence of racial prejudice towards certain groups. And it's interesting that Tim made that comment after reading the 2020 Scanlon Mapping Social Cohesion Report. So the topic is territory for a rich and important discussion. And to help with that, we're very lucky to have two special guest speakers here today to address that question. The first speaker is Emeritus Professor Andrew Markus of Monash University. Andrew is author of the 2020 Mapping Social Cohesion Report and has authored previous reports in this series. Andrew's research specialises in racial and ethnic relations, ethnic communities, and immigration policy. And for this work, he was recently awarded an Order of Australia. Our keynote speaker is Monica Forson. Monica is a passionate community development advocate, and she has extensive experience in government settings as a policy and project officer. She is Senior Advisor on Community Engagement at the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission, and she's co-founder and president of the Afro-Australian Student Association. But her CV goes much further than that. She's worked with the Maribyrnong Council, she's worked with the Department of Premier and Cabinet, and she spent 3 years working on community engagement at the Victoria Police. Monica is a respected young leader in the Victorian community, advising a range of government and non-government stakeholders about the importance of diversity and inclusion. Thanks for being here, Monica, today, and thank you, Andrew. Now, before we begin, I'd like to give you a few housekeeping items about how we're going to run the session today. The session is being recorded and it will be available via the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute YouTube channel in coming days. And we hope that you'll refer back to it and share the link with your colleagues. For those of you who want to take the conversation online today via social media, please do so using the hashtag @SocialCohesionReport. Finally, this is going to be a very interactive session today. We'll run some polls of you, the audience, as we go. We want to hear what you think. So if a poll comes up while one of our speakers is presenting and you want to express a view, just jump in. And after Andrew and Monica have spoken, we'll have a Q&A session to take questions from you and give you a chance to express your views. So to do all that, we'll be using Mentimeter. Now, Mentimeter is an interactive event tool, and we'll be using that through the event to enable you to contribute to the discussion and submit questions for our Q&A segment. Now, if you haven't used Mentimeter before, it's very simple. All you need to do is follow one of the prompts on the screen now. You either go to menti.com on your desktop or smartphone browser, and you enter the code at the top of the screen, or you simply scan the QR code on your smartphone to join in. As the event goes on, I'll be giving you some prompts to make sure that you are joining Mentimeter. The great thing about Mentimeter is that it enables us to poll you, the audience, to find out what you think. And as I say, we'll run a few polls, and let's start with one right now. Riley, if you could open up our first poll. And it's quite a simple question, really, which is, do you believe racial discrimination in Australia is about the same, increasing, or reducing? That's the subject we'll be talking about now. So it'd be really good to hear what you, the audience, think on that question. And while we're doing that, I might introduce our first speaker, Andrew Markus. Now, Andrew, as I said, has got immense experience in this area, and he's going to speak about what we found on this question of racism and discrimination in the 2020 Social Cohesion Report, and perhaps what we've found in other reports as well in the past. I think there's really some key questions to ask here about how the COVID pandemic has impacted discrimination findings, and also how things have changed over time, and how they might have changed over time for specific ethnic groups or religious groups in the Australian community. Now, before we do that, let's look at the poll results. The poll is still going on, but it's really interesting. Right now, we're seeing more people think that it's increasing or about the same, and a small number think it's reducing. So with that backdrop, I might start, Andrew, throwing to you and shedding some light for us on these questions and the context of discrimination in Australia today. Thank you, Andrew.
I'll even unmute my speaker. It makes it even better.
Thanks, Andrew. That's great.
So I just pay my respects to the traditional owners, past, present, and emerging. All right. So what I'm going to be doing today is just giving you some overview of what we can actually find out from surveys. And I want to emphasize the point that survey data always is open to interpretation. And different people will do different surveys and end up with quite different results. So I'll be taking you through some of that issue. But there's another very important point that I want to make, and that is, what do we measure the level of discrimination against? We need some sort of criteria. So at one level, obviously, any incidence of discrimination is too high. So 0 is what we're measuring against. But also at another level, and we want to understand this from a rounded perspective. From another perspective, what do we think is normative in a society? A difficult question to examine, but I think one that we also should pay some attention to. For example, if we look at the issue of immigration and we say, what do Australians think about immigration? And 35% of Australians think it's too high, so 35% too high. Is that a good result or a bad result? And it depends on what we measure that against. So this is a difficult conversation, but I want to introduce this conversation also as part of the discussion. All right, so let me just take you through then this issue. So racial hierarchies, which I guess are the basis for the way that people will discriminate. I don't know of any society where they don't exist, racial or ethnic hierarchies. And I want to make the point, it's not something that's unique to Western societies. Let's look at some of the evidence on this point. If we look at the hierarchies in Australia's past, and the point is that in the 1920s, like in a way, the hierarchy has always been the same, but the way that society responds to that hierarchy changes. So, for example, with regard to immigration policy, who got assisted passages to come here? Who was admitted recently freely? Who only in very limited numbers? And who was denied permanent residence? So, in a way, even though the policy settings have changed in terms of immigration policies, the basic hierarchy has not shifted. Or I would argue that it has not shifted. We look at the way the societies categorize their populations, and one indication is the census. Now, in our census, we have an ancestry question. And there's suggestions about how you might define your ancestry: English, Irish, Scottish, Italian, German. Now, in other countries, for example, in the United Kingdom, the references in the census are not to ethnicity, not to ancestry, but to ethnicity. A number of categories are suggested: white, mixed, multiple, Asian, Black, African, Caribbean, Black, British, other. These are sort of racialized categories that in our census are not so upfront. Whether that's significant or not, I leave it for you to consider. If we look at American categories, in America, race as a category is upfront and non-problematical. And there's white, Hispanic, Black, Asian, so a broad list of so-called racial categories. The notion, for example, that Middle Eastern people form a race. And in a society such as America, that is basically accepted and not challenged as far as the census goes. I think I managed to miss a slide here. Yeah, good. Now, if we look at findings in Australia, and this is from the Scanlon Foundation survey, and this is a sort of question that interestingly is not often asked in surveying, but a ranking of ethnic preference. So what we find here is that European national groups, relatively low levels of negative feeling, whereas as you can see from that slide, high levels of negative feeling relatively towards people from Africa, Sudanese, Middle East, Iraq, China, and a very clear hierarchy. And it seems to be quite consistent in the surveying that we've done over time. But for example, if we look at England, and this is a question that asked in the 2012 survey, and people were asked, do you think that people who've been resident in the United Kingdom for 10 years or more, they should be allowed to introduce their families under family reunion schemes? And you see attitudes are net 6% negative to Western Europe, negative 23% Eastern Europe, Muslim countries and Africa. So this hierarchy is something that's not embedded in Australian society particularly. And one other example is, this is in the World Values Surveys, and people from different countries are asked, what would you think of a neighbour from a different race, or an immigrant or foreign worker from a different country being your neighbour? And again, you can see a very strong hierarchy of preference, low levels of negativity in Australia, relatively high levels of negativity in a number of other countries. All right, now quickly, experience of discrimination. And we've got a whole range of data sets in addition to the Scanlon Foundation, such as Reconciliation Australia and Lowy Institute and other surveys as well. What we find with regard to Indigenous respondents is about half of them was saying that I've had an experience of racial prejudice in the last 6 months, and that's been increasing. The ANU Centre for Social Research and Methods found that their surveys actually don't indicate any increase in 2020, but they found that 85%, 84.5% of the people of Asian background have reported experience of discrimination. But the way they got that is that they had 5 response options and they answered 4, they counted 4, including hardly ever. So this is the problem of interpreting survey findings. How do you add the numbers? The Lowy Institute found that, for example, 18% of their respondents had been physically threatened or attacked. Higher proportion had been called offensive names, and these are people from Asian backgrounds. So this is just some of the data that is available to us. In the Scanlon Foundation survey conducted in July 2020, about 40% of people from an Asian country had indicated that they had experienced discrimination, and it was much higher than respondents who were born in Australia or the United Kingdom. When we analyse experience of discrimination, much higher reporting of experiences of discrimination amongst the younger age groups than amongst, say, people over the age of 55. A whole range of questions show up this relativity of people from an Asian background in our survey reporting high levels of concern. So 55% indicated that they were concerned for their members of their own community, compared to 30% Australian-born. Still high, but it's a ratio of 2 to 1 there. How big a problem is racism? And again, we're getting this differentiation. People of Asian backgrounds say that it's a very big problem or fairly big problem, compared to about 1/3, still high, amongst Australian-born. When we ask people, where are you most likely to experience discrimination? The highest proportion are when shopping, on public transport, at work, on the street, but also in the workplace comes up, but not as strongly. And online is a major locale for experience of discrimination. So, for example, women, 74% aged 18 to 24 indicate that they'd seen racist content on Facebook, very high number. Now, the last point I want to make, and I think this is one of the key findings that I take out of the Scanlon Foundation reports, is that the people with strong negative attitudes are a small segment of the population. So to turn this around, who engages in acts of discrimination? And I would say that the survey findings would point to the fact that it's most likely a very small segment of the population, say 4 to 10%, have strongly negative or racist, bigoted views. But it's not something that's across the community. And probably in this regard, Australians are at the low end of the spectrum when we compare different national groups. However, this is in response to general questions, say about multiculturalism and people with very strong negative views. If we look at attitudes to specific groups, such as people from China, Sudan, Muslims, we are getting higher levels of entrenched negative views in the range 13 to 18%. So again, it's a problem. How do you interpret this data? But the essential point, which I think maybe we can take away from this, is that the large majority of the population are not bigoted, well disposed. And it becomes then an issue of strategies, like how do we bring people along to a recognition that there's a problem here and to understand the magnitude of the problem. All right, so looking at this issue, and I apologize for this, some spelling mistakes in this report, but if we think about racial hierarchy and all cultures, is Australia distinctive? In what respect is Australia distinctive? I think that's an issue that's worth discussing. What is the extent of discrimination that people experience? And it's not easy to establish that if you want to put a number to it. Maybe you don't want to put a number to it. Maybe we say, whether it's 10%, 20%, 80%, it doesn't matter. It's too high and we need to have an approach. And we do. But I think it's also relevant to try to get a sense of what is the magnitude of the issue that we're dealing with in terms of working out approaches. And then the last point I made is to try to understand who it is that discriminates, who is fervently opposed to discrimination, and what are the best strategies and response options in that context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That is fascinating and a very nuanced opening to our discussion. Just a quick point, a couple of people have wondered whether this will be shared. Yes, it will. You'll be able to see this on YouTube in a couple of days. So if you missed a chart, don't worry, there will be an opportunity for you to look at Andrew's charts. Andrew, can I just, before we move on, I just want to ask you a couple of questions about the work. Tim Supomasan's point about the enduring paradox of Australian multiculturalism. Do you agree that there is a paradox here? When you look at these figures, some of the numbers on hostility towards specific groups are quite high. And yet at the same time, Australians in general express this positive view about immigration and multiculturalism. And we stack up well on those general numbers against comparable countries around the world. So how do you explain that, what seems on the outside to be a paradox?
It may not be a paradox.
Maybe not.
It may be answers to different questions. And that's what we've got to get our heads around. You're being asked different questions so that they're not equivalent. Yeah. So one fundamental point is that we live in a country where 80+% of people are positively disposed to multiculturalism. You don't get that in many countries in the world, if any other country, maybe Canada, New Zealand, maybe a few countries, but that is a very strong finding. The other aspect is the discrimination. So it's not as if 80% of people discriminate, because that would be the equivalent, 80 there, 80 here. Yeah. I would think it's the people who discriminate are a fragment of that segment who are not well disposed to multiculturalism and who are not disposed to an open society. Yeah. And so rather than necessarily seeing that as a paradox, the way I've been thinking about this issue is we see it as a challenge. And then how is it that we actually mobilize that tremendously goodwill of one of the few societies on the planet where you have high levels of support for immigration and an open immigration policy. And then also to understand that there are segments and segments of concern within that. So if we look at Indigenous issues, I think that that's of a different magnitude and there's a different history and a different trajectory. If we look at immigration issues, then I think we're looking at other aspects. And we also need to unpack, I'm sorry, I'm going on for a bit. We need to unpack what it is that people support about multiculturalism. And what they support, I think the survey findings indicate, what is supported is that policy of integration, of coming together, of Australians getting to know immigrants and immigrants adapting to what people expect in terms of their behaviour. So it's complex, it's many-faceted, but I don't think it's necessarily a paradox and we can unpack it.
Do we have a sense, Andrew? That's really interesting. I wonder if we have a sense about the last year. Let's just talk briefly about COVID before we go to Monica's presentation. Some of the reporting suggests that feelings about specific groups have remained the same with certain groups, but it's clear that with people of East Asian background, I think in particular people of Chinese background, there is a change in the data. Can you talk us through that? And whether and how COVID has contributed to that.
Yep. So difficult to interpret survey findings, because if what you have is a finding at a particular point in time, but you don't know how that question was answered a year ago or 2 years ago, then I think you have to be careful about how much weight that you attach to that. Yeah. So where we've actually got data in the Scanlon Foundation surveys that gives us long-term trend data, like, for example, attitude to Muslim Australians, where we've got long-term trend data and other questions, we're actually not picking up any increase. The ANU Centre for Social Research, they had actually some long-run data and they weren't picking up any increase. But then on the other hand, when we ask Asian Australians, do you think that things got same, better or worse? There's certainly a sense within that community that things have got worse and things have got substantially worse. So I think we have to give credence to that. But there's also the Indigenous data that I showed you, where there's again like 4 data points, time points. And again, where they were getting like 40%, now they're getting plus 50%. So one would think that there is an increase, but probably we want to sort of necessarily understand that increase. Like, is it about people being frightened? Or is it that some of these far right groups seeing an opportunity and mobilizing and getting some traction in that sort of context?
Yes, it's so important to get at the specifics, and that's what Scanlon's been doing for so long. And by having this data sets over now 13 years, since 2007, it really enables us to start to see those kind of trend lines over time. We're now going to turn to what do we do about this. Monica is going to speak to us about her experience, what she has observed and studied in relation to racial discrimination in Australia and in Victoria, and also what we might do about it. While Monica is presenting, Monica's going to present for 15 to 20 minutes. And while she's presenting, there'll be a poll coming up. So please jump in and express your views on that poll as she speaks. But Monica, you've just heard Andrew's presentation. So let's hear from you about the way you think Australia needs to respond to these challenges. Thank you.
Great, so much, James. So hi everyone, it's really great to be with you all this afternoon to have this really important and really timely discussion about racism. The recent Black Lives Matter protests put us in a really unique global moment, a moment which has provided an opportunity to have a really frank discussion about the impact of racism in our country. Before I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land that I'm meeting you all from today. So I'm on Wiradjuri Woiwurrung and Woiwurrung land, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people tuning in today. A little over 12 months ago, a worldwide reckoning began. The murder of George Floyd sparked protests and solidarity on almost every continent and triggered a really important and well overdue discussion about structural racism in Australia. The events that took place in June of last year renewed our attention on the long-standing problem of racism and discrimination in Australia, where we had protests about the devastating and pervasive statistics regarding Aboriginal deaths in custody. And for everyone tuning in today, we all know that there was a Royal Commission into deaths in custody, which made 399 recommendations, and that was written 30 years ago now. But since that date, 400 Aboriginal people have died in custody. And sadly, last week, there was another death. So Australia is a country that's really proud of its multiculturalism and its multiracial diversity, and nearly 50% of our population is either born overseas or have a parent who was born overseas like me. Alongside Canada and New Zealand, Australia is among one of the first countries to adopt an official policy on multiculturalism. And this means that there's the right of citizenship for everyone, includes that they can express their cultural identity and heritage freely. In simple terms, there's no one way to be Australian, and we can express ourselves and our cultural diversity no matter what our colour or creed. And as shown by Andrew earlier in his presentation with the data from the Scanlon Social Cohesion Report, Australians by and large believe multiculturalism is good for our country, with 84% of respondents endorsing multiculturalism. More so, there's really strong acceptance of immigration, with 71% of respondents agreeing that accepting immigrants from different countries makes Australia stronger. And even further to that, 82% of respondents agreed that immigrants to our country should not be rejected simply on the basis of their race or ethnicity. So with all this great stuff, why does racism exist? Racism persists, and it persists in significant forms for First Nation people and other people of colour in Australia. So before I talk about some of the present day issues of structural racism in Australia, I'd like to quickly talk about and touch on the history of institutionalized racism in our country and the symbolic nature of this discrimination enshrined in our Constitution. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about the Victorian perspective and experiences of structural discrimination during the COVID pandemic and the role the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission played to protect and support multicultural communities. Finally, then I'd like to speak about the roles of individuals, communities, and workplaces and what they can do to reduce racism, specifically focusing on the stronger need for legal protections to protect individuals and discuss the proposed amendments to the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act. So, racism in Australia. Historically, racism in Australia has been expressed as explicit or overtly harmful behaviours, attitudes, or hostilities towards minorities. This type of racism is rooted in white supremacy ideology that has been practiced by individuals, groups, and institutions under the belief of biological difference and inferiority. This type of racism was socially accepted, and some today might argue still is, and was upheld by government policies such as the White Australia policy and the forcible removal of Aboriginal children from their parents. And to this day, inequality is woven into our constitution, where we've got federal laws which allow for laws to be made about people from particular races. The race's power in section 51 of the Constitution gives the Parliament the power to make laws for the people of any race for whom it's deemed necessary to make special laws. And this was introduced in 1901 when the Constitution was written to regulate migration from particular parts of the world because there was concern about Chinese and other Asian immigrants after the gold rush period, so in the late 19th century. And it wasn't too long ago that these powers were used to implement the Northern Territory Intervention in 2007 for Aboriginal people, which is out of step with international law and the fundamental tenets of international human rights law that all people have the right to be treated equally before the law. Additionally, Section 25 of our Constitution allows for people to be potentially disqualified from voting in state elections because of their race. Thankfully, this has been addressed with the Racial Discrimination Act, which already stops this from occurring. Whilst Australia's constitutional powers have not been used to distinguish citizens of immigrant heritage based upon their race in contemporary times, we cannot pretend that such explicit institutional expressions of racism and discrimination are not harmful and that they're not symbolic of a nation built on the ideology of biological difference and inferiority. These structural legacies of racism permeate through our justice, health, and education systems, as well as our workplaces and even interactions with our fellow neighbours. So thinking now about racism in Victoria, in the Victorian context. The Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission has a significant role to play in protecting the rights of multicultural communities in Victoria. Whilst racism and experiences of discrimination because of race have always been a really big issue reported to the Commission, 2020 was really different. We saw a significant increase in inquiries, reports, and complaints about racial discrimination and vilification throughout the pandemic. The pandemic really exposed the underlying inequalities that impacted multicultural and multi-faith communities, including the profound level of racism and vilification faced by visible communities, visible minority groups. And in 2020, the Commission received a total of 406 inquiries specifically related to racism. And of those inquiries, 38% were related to race vilification or hate speech. And that's more than double the numbers received in 2019. Many of the reports we received during this time were from individuals who I said before were visibly diverse. And during the first wave of the pandemic, we saw a number of reports from Chinese or people of East Asian heritage. The reports ranged from COVID-inspired racism in the workplace, online, in supermarkets, in the workplaces, very similar to the things that Andrew mentioned earlier in his presentation. But I just wanted to share with you some of the reports that we received. So one of the reports, a gentleman said, I rode the tram in the city with my children, and a white man in his 50s or 60s suddenly swore at me and said there were too many Asians in Australia. He then cursed at me. Since then, I haven't been able to ride the tram because of the trauma. Another person reported to us, I work at a car crash repair company, and a manager put a sign up saying we were closed due to the coronavirus outbreak. After that, I was stood down. I'm the only Asian person at work, and I also speak Chinese. I do think that it was racism. And then finally, another report we received at the height of the pandemic was a young boy who's of Eurasian heritage, and he was with his Chinese Australian friend, and they'd been fishing, and a group of 4 white men came up to him, started coughing at him and laughing at him, and it made that young boy feel really, really scared. So that's just a bit of the flavour of the sorts of reports we received. And during the second wave of the pandemic, a broader range of multicultural and multi-faith communities reported COVID-inspired racism. Through increased utilisation of the Commission's community reporting tool, which allows anonymous reporting of racist incidents, we also heard from community that the media was judging particular community groups, large multicultural groups, and so they were fueling the pandemic. That Muslims and Africans were fearful of being targeted by authorities when in public spaces, and that systemic racism by government towards multicultural communities was a factor during the temporary full lockdown of the public housing commissions in North Melbourne and Flemington. So the pandemic really painted a broader picture about the more systemic failures for Victoria's multicultural communities. The pandemic disproportionately impacted multicultural communities facing disadvantage and marginalisation, who through a lack of access to technology and accessible translated materials did not have the same tools, resources or supports to know about, understand, prepare for, or even comply with public health directives and remain safe like any other Victorian. Whilst I'm not suggesting that there was a conscious level of racism by individuals at play by government or in government during the height of the pandemic, at a macro level, the mechanisms to provide critical information and support within our government produced and augmented racial inequalities. In Victoria, this is an issue because public authorities have an obligation to protect and promote human rights for the people they serve under the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities. And this includes an obligation to ensure individuals have the right to equality. During this period as well, we also heard really alarming concerns about policing activities, which disproportionately impacted vulnerable groups, including people of South Sudanese heritage and Aboriginal people, who were overrepresented in the fines given out by Victoria Police during the first lockdown. So data released by the CSA, or the Crime Statistics Agency, showed that whilst people born in Sudan and South Sudan represent 0.4% of the population, they made up 5% of people who received fines. And similarly, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people made up 4.7% of fines, despite making up only 0.8% of the population in Victoria. The overrepresentation of Aboriginal and African young people in the justice system is well documented. The pandemic only highlighted the complex factors contributing to this overrepresentation, with systemic racism and discrimination being one continuing but pertinent factor. To respond to the immediate needs of community during the pandemic, the Commission did a lot of work to deeply engage with communities across Victoria to understand the impact of COVID-inspired racism, but also, and then really importantly, to provide support to those community groups who'd been discriminated against because of their race. We provided information about human rights to community leaders in the public housing lockdowns in North Melbourne and Flemington, who were placed into lockdown to prevent the transmission of COVID. And we also attended community information sessions, produced fact sheets, which were translated into multiple languages. And we made sure that they were both in written form, but also we had audio files. And we worked really closely with community legal centres to monitor the human rights situations on the ground. So whilst the COVID-19 pandemic, it might not discriminate, the public housing lockdown showed how the impact of the virus was felt more severely by those who already experienced discrimination and disadvantage, and by those who are living in environments like public housing where it's really difficult to socially isolate. The lockdown also demonstrated the dynamics of structural failures for multicultural communities who encountered systemic failures by public authorities to properly consult with and engage with them when creating responses which affect them. And thinking back to the Black Lives Matter protests and the full lockdown at the public housing in Flemington and North Melbourne, both of those moments in 2020 were really momentous. For some, it brought about disbelief, outrage, and exposed the massive and widening social inequalities across our nation. But for others, particularly Aboriginal and people of colour, these events brought angst and a deep weariness, as these moments were just another demonstration of a painful history of racism in our country. So what is the role of government, communities, workplaces, and policy to positively shift this issue and to stop or reduce discrimination and racism? I'll touch on this in a moment and particularly talk about the important role of independent authorities like the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission to address systemic racism and really other forms of discrimination. So in the world according to Monica, what I think on a federal level, I think that's simple. It's remove sections of the Constitution which allow laws to be made for particular races of people. We should have an Indigenous voice to Parliament enshrined to provide a structural response to empower First Nation people in Australia, as articulated in the Uluru Statement. In Victoria, this type of work's already underway, and the Commission welcomes the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria and the journey that our government's going through to have a treaty process in our state. We also really welcome the Truth and Justice Commission, which was announced last week, which will work to address historic wrongs and ongoing injustices for Aboriginal Victorians. And these are really great and really important steps in addressing racism. But we need to do more in Victoria, and we really do need stronger laws to protect people from hate. So in Victoria, our current anti-vilification law doesn't go far enough to protect Victorians from hate, and it doesn't do enough to make sure that everyone's living in a safe and inclusive society. As regulators of Victoria's anti-vilification law, the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act, the Commission has seen firsthand both the significant harm of vilification and other forms of hate speech, as well as the limitations of the current law in being able to prevent and respond to those harms. To date, there's only been 2 successful cases brought to VCAT. One of the factors that's made it really hard to use this law and for people to run successful vilification cases is its high legal threshold that people must meet to show that the vilification has occurred. The civil test for vilification really needs to be simplified, and the law needs to change to focus on the harm caused by vilification. And while it's appropriate that criminal offences should only apply to the most serious of conduct, the current criminal test is too high and really needs to be simplified. It should be revised to prohibit intentional or reckless hate conduct, and it should prohibit threats to harm or incite hate. The Commission really welcomes the final report released earlier this month by the Victorian Parliament's Legal and Social Affairs Committee's inquiry into anti-vilification protection in Victoria. The recommendations put forward are in line with the Commission's view about how best we can strengthen the law to make it more effective. And the report's also given our state a roadmap for reforms that must be implemented to make sure that all Victorians feel safe and included. The recommendations alleviate some of the burden that currently exists with individuals who experience hate and who are reluctant to come up and complain. And this is a really welcome shift. For example, an important recommendation is incorporating vilification protections into the EOA and introducing a positive duty for organisations to prevent vilification. So this effectively puts institutions on notice to take positive steps to prevent and eliminate vilification. And another really exciting recommendation is to increase community education about the harm of vilification, which is a really, really important step in dismantling the entrenched and systemic racism in so many areas of public life. From a community perspective, I think there are a number of ways to address racism, but I think it's really important for people to start to think of racism and respond to racism from a public health perspective. Rather than positioning racism as a political or ideological concern, research indicates there's a strong association between frequent experiences of racism and mental ill health. So could people think of racism in a similar relationship between smoking and physical ill health? So therefore, to reduce discrimination and racism, we really need effective ways to improve mental health and to stop the internalization and shame of racist experiences, which increase an individual's risk of mental ill health. And for me, this is personally important for young people because I really do think they need to foster a sense of strong identity and belonging in this country. The Commission regularly hears about the harmful impact of racist bullying and unfair treatment in schools, and multicultural communities who participated in our racism information session last year strongly expressed that one of the key challenges that young people face in schools is racism. And this isn't just an issue for newly arrived communities, and it's an issue for people who identify as second, third, or fourth generation. And I think that's really important to touch on. For me, I've experienced racism in schools, and I'm not from a new and emerging community necessarily. So we have to kind of open our minds to what we see as issues for different community groups. So to foster psychologically safe and respectful schools, we have to foster psychologically safe and respectful schools, we've heard repeatedly from community groups for the need to deliver anti-racism programs in schools. And we've also heard about the importance of having diverse cultural representation in the curriculum in both a primary school setting and a secondary school setting. And we've also heard the really important role that school teachers play to address and respond and prevent racism. But psychological safety isn't just important in an education, from an educational perspective, it's also really important in the workplace. A new report by the Diversity Council of Australia and the University of Sydney found that 59% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander workers experience racism based on their appearance, and almost a third of those people said that their workplace was culturally unsafe. And whilst I can't find a particular report which discusses those issues from a multicultural experience, I know from anecdotal stories that there's a need for greater support for culturally diverse staff who also face structural and cultural forms of racial discrimination in the workplace. This includes genuinely improving diversity and inclusion practices through the recruitment, retention, and progression of diverse staff process. And it means changing attitudes and behaviours through training and structural reform. And it might, dare I say, include quotas and targets as part of a really holistic and meaningful change program. And I'm happy to discuss this more during our Q&A section in a moment. And finally, on a individual level, there's so much work that people can do. Leaders and employers must learn to really listen to their multicultural colleagues, to recognize their own biases, to recognize their histories, and really try to think about their everyday actions in a new light. They must also acknowledge the impact of colorism in our community and the distinct experiences that individuals with darker skin tones face in the workplace. And ultimately, leaders must understand that being vocal about race, diversity, and inclusion is their responsibility and not the job of their culturally diverse colleagues. So in conclusion, we've made really great progress in combating racism in Australia, but it's so vital that we maintain our efforts. The movement that's taking place right now mustn't stop, and it really has to lead to a more equitable society for all. If I hear another well-intentioned person say, well, each new community experiences a bit of racism, oh, the Greeks, the Italians, the Vietnamese had to deal with racism, and this is some sort of acceptable rite of passage in Australia, and now it's time for Africans and Muslims to deal with it. I really don't know what I'll do, to be completely honest. We must continue to have laws in our country that set a standard on racial discrimination. We must continue to acknowledge the harmful and painful legacy of racism in our country to First Nation people and to multicultural communities. And we really must do everything we can to challenge prejudice and discrimination. And that's in our roles in our workplace and as individuals as well, to make sure that Australia really is a fair and safe and inclusive country for all. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Monica. That was a terrific presentation. So broad. You brought in history, you brought in a strong Indigenous perspective, you raised the Black Lives Matter movement, very important event last year in terms of focusing this discussion, and really interesting how that event, which of course happened in the United States, has had global resonances. And then you talked about what we do now, and you raised a lot of topics that we're going to discuss, I think, in a moment, that will be of great interest to our audience in terms of what are the responses to discrimination and racism. Just before we go on, though, before I open it up to Q&A, we're going to have two more polls, quick polls. Can you please go to menti.com or use and enter the code that's there? We're going to ask you two quick questions. The first one, Illy, if you could bring it up, is can your organisation do more to counter discrimination? Remember menti.com and the code there, or the QR chart, that QR code that was there on the screen before. So let's please answer that question. Then we'll have one more. Then we'll get on to what the audience thinks, and give you the chance to ask Monica and Andrew some questions about this discussion. There's a clear yes there at this point. It was really interesting, Monica. I might just open our discussion a bit while we're doing this poll. One thing that came up that interested me is the question of representation of people. Australia is a very diverse society now in terms of its overall population, but it seems there's no doubt that the representation of people from new groups and from Indigenous Australia is not equivalent, I think, to their numbers in the society. Tim Supomasan, I think, authored a report, or his commission authored a report about representation in the law, in parliaments and public service. I wonder if that's something that you've considered at the commission as well as an issue that Australia needs to address.
Yeah, definitely it's a major issue in our country. In Victoria, the commission deals with Victoria, so that's my biggest focus at the moment.
Yep.
But what even for me on a personal level, when I go into organizations, when I think about the departments that I'm working in, I'm really cognizant of the fact that I might be the only visibly diverse person in that arena. And I think it's incredibly important to ponder on that and think about how can we increase diversity within governments, within organisations, having diverse people represented in our parliament. Earlier in my presentation, I spoke about Canada and New Zealand, and to just see how reflective of the community their parliaments are, I do think puts Australia to shame in a sense. Like, I can't wait for the day that there's a proud South Asian person, maybe a Sikh person that shows their religious attire that can walk into our parliament. I can't wait until there's increased African or sub-Saharan African representation in our parliaments as well. Thinking to like how we can get to that point. Perhaps it is about having training programs and mentoring programs to support people and foster their interests and capabilities to work in those arenas. But I also think it's important for mainstream communities to acknowledge the privileges that they currently have and maybe step aside or support and uplift minorities in this country.
Thanks, Monica. Illy, let's run our second poll. We've done a poll about organisations. What about individuals? Do we do enough as individuals to counter discrimination against others?
Is that a question for me, or is that a question for
It's a question for everybody.
Okay, cool.
People are responding on many. You can answer it though if you want to. Why don't you answer
it? I think that in Australia, it's sometimes really hard for people to acknowledge the privileges that they have. We live in a country where whiteness is the norm. And I think that when you don't really have to consider your race, or it's not the first thing you think of, it can be really hard to counter discrimination when you don't necessarily perceive that you could be perpetrating that discrimination or bias.
Yes, and Andrew, I wonder what you think about what Monica's saying. Do you think that it's interesting? You've looked at the data over a long time, and you do see I think what strikes me about your presentation is that you do see positive trends amongst this, and that it's important that we focus on racism and discrimination where it exists, but also look at the trends where we can see improvement. And Monica, you also mentioned you think that we are in some areas going in the right direction. I guess how we strike that balance between being vigilant and I suppose celebrating when improvement has happened, but remaining vigilant to the existence of discrimination.
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about this, we operate on many fronts, not one front. And I think the questions that we're asking also reflect that. So one key component is the institutional front, and Monica has dealt with that. And that's hugely important because in a way, you've got very clear targets that you can aim to achieve, and you can analyze the structures and institutions. I think that when we're dealing with people's attitudes in a more general sense, it's much more difficult. Monica, I'd be interested to have your take on that in a way, it's not to say that you can actually achieve the outcomes you want, but you can more clearly define what needs to be done at an institutional level. Would you agree with that? Whereas in the general social level, to change opinion and to overcome the sort of barriers that we see endemic in our society with regard to colour and people's background, much more difficult.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think that change really has to come from the top for these sorts of things. So unless we see it, if we don't see it in our parliamentary systems, in our boardrooms and all these other platforms, what's the motivation, what's the incentive for people to really make those changes in their own personal lives? So I think that in an Australian context, when there's more diversity on those other levels, then we'll start to see acceptance, but also an understanding that there are racial inequalities in Australia. Yeah. And that we as individuals and businesses and government communities have a role to play in fixing those inequalities.
Like, how positive are you when you see some of the initiatives that are being undertaken in Victoria? You think that they are taking significant steps or really just part of the way? I'm talking about level of government.
I think that there's always room for improvement, but I don't see any other state having a truth and justice reconciliation sort of commission being established, the work that they're doing with First Nation communities. There's also been the establishment of a South Asian advisory group, an African Victorian advisory group. So I do personally think there's meaningful work being done by our government, and also the work of the commission. It is a statutory authority, but the work that we're doing to prevent and respond to hate is incredibly important. So I'm not completely pessimistic about where we're going, but I do think that we could do it quicker and make sure that we're bringing people along on the journey. I think it's one thing to establish all these things and have Anglo-Australian people leading the charge, but I do think there's a role to make sure that there's a diversity of people in charge making these changes as well.
Thank you, Monica. Time's moving on, so I think we might go now to our audience Q&A. We're already getting lots of questions coming in, so let's throw the discussion open to what the audience is asking. In the middle of this discussion, we will ask you one more question on the poll, so we'd like you to jump in and answer that on menti.com. But I'm going to start by this question here. What approaches should we take to training programs around white privilege? It's a really sensitive topic for many. Monica, I might get you to address that question.
What approaches should we take? I think that the first thing when we're having these discussions and training about white privilege is probably for people to enter them knowing that they might say the wrong thing and not being judged. I think the biggest blockage that we can have when having these discussions is prematurely judging people and not asking them why they've come to that thought, and how can we change those perceptions, or how can we enlighten them with more information. So I do think that it's very easy to judge and criticize others, but starting from a point of understanding and empathy, kill them with kindness, so to speak. And I do think that will then lead to more fruitful discussions about white privilege.
Thanks, Monica. I'm going to ask a question to you, Andrew. The research focused on immigrants from China, or people of Chinese background, whereas the data showed that negative attitude towards Chinese has decreased, but negative attitude towards people of Sudanese background has increased. Do you have an answer or a theory as to why that might be the case?
We have to be careful how we read the data. So, 2 or 3% or 4% shift when we're talking around 45, 50% negative in that context, it's not huge. So I think that's the first thing, that we don't want to overanalyze and overread the data. And I think the data with regard to the experience of people of Chinese background, Chinese Australians, is mixed. Some data shows that it's similar to data that we obtained in the past, but others show that it's actually worsened. And I think there's certainly a perception that it has worsened. No question that we have got issues with regard to visible minorities. And that should present us with a challenge. I think, Monica, what I took out from your answer to the previous question is we want to help people understand themselves, so that in any sort of programs in organizations, the starting point should be for people to reflect on themselves in a supportive environment, so that they can better understand why it is that they hold the attitudes that they hold. Why is it that Australia is very positive with regard to some issues, but not other issues, when you would expect to see a consistency? So to take people along this journey of understanding where there is a basis of goodwill and a willingness to go there, which is not, of course, always the case.
Thanks, Andrew. And I want to ask both of you the next question. Monica, I might start with you. We've discussed it a bit, but let's focus in on organisations and workplaces for a moment. what is the most impactful thing an organisation or a workplace can do to combat discrimination?
For me, two things come to mind immediately. The first is making sure that organizations are reflective of the communities they represent. So I do think it's important to have diverse staff in workplaces, and that can be done through quotas or other mechanisms and entry points into organizations, which I think is really important. But I think that it's also important for staff members to understand and know that their organizations can protect them from discrimination, do care about their unique experiences of racial discrimination in the workplace, and do something to prevent it. So either having those really hard conversations about inappropriate conduct, making sure people are aware when things are inappropriate, and also escalating them to the the organizations which can support them, be it like WorkSafe or the Commission. So seeing that there are outcomes and consequences for poor behavior and poor conduct.
Andrew, do you have thoughts on the question from where you sit?
In a similar way to what I said previously, that it's simpler in an organisation to set up rules and then to ensure that those rules are being followed, to be asking, probing questions, like Monica's data on fines handed out by police, where there's an overrepresentation or 10 or 15 times what the ratio should be, to look into that and to investigate that and to say, why is that? Has there been a systemic failure? If so, why has there been a systemic failure? I think at an organisational level, I can glibly say it's easy, but you can certainly set the parameters in a way that you can, because the place is contained and you know what you should be doing and you know what the targets should be. It's much more difficult beyond that. Like even the issue of appropriate representation within, say, the media of diverse voices, or within our parliamentary institutions. These are very complex issues. Because what does it mean, for example, for this community to be represented? An individual may not represent that community, even though they are from that birthplace. So these, I think, are quite complex and much more difficult issues to deal with in a meaningful way. But in a place like Victoria, which should really be a leader, and in many respects is a leader, not only in the nation, but internationally, to deal with these structural issues of discrimination and racism, there should be no question that we need to go forward in that space.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm going to ask this question now to both of you, and it's a tough one, but I think it's really important because, of course, it's true, as the questioner says here, how do each of you define racism? Is it unhelpful to put the full range of behaviours and attitudes under a single umbrella? Because, of course, it's true, isn't it, that discrimination can be anything from, a nasty word in a supermarket to a violent assault and all in between. So I'm just wondering if one of you wants to jump in first and tell us how you define racism.
I think for me, as I mentioned in my presentation, racism is based on racial superiority or a perception of a superiority against another, and generally in an Australian context, that is whiteness over other cultures and other diversity. In respects to, do I think it's unhelpful to put it under an umbrella of behaviours? I don't think so. I do think there's a spectrum of racism, and that it could start off as generalizations or particular words being said to others which are racially charged. But I do think it goes all the way to physical violence and other crimes which are based on or perpetrated because of someone's race. So I think it is really important to look at it holistically and see how the manifestations of one word being said can propel and lead people to act in different ways, but it's still based on a hatred or a dislike of another culture.
Thanks, Monica. Andrew, how do you, given what Monica just said, how do you respond? How do you define racism?
Yeah, I've probably got a similar approach. Like, I actually try to avoid the use of the term racism. So, for example, you won't find reference to racism, I don't think, in the Scanlon Foundation reports. The danger with the term is that it can close conversations rather than open conversations. And what we want to do is to open conversations, to understand, as this question suggests, the full range of behaviours, and to understand the background to those behaviours, the background to those attitudes. Obviously, this doesn't work for everybody, but with many people, they're open to critical reflection on their behaviour. It's probably a minority who behave in a negative way, but there are people who are open, and what we want to do is to open conversations with them. But at the end of the day, that point again that came out of Monica's speech is the health aspect, the harm that is done to individuals by, we can't say, well, this form of behaviour is benign and it's not going to have much impact, and that form of behaviour is very dangerous, because what you might think as benign can actually blight a person's life. But I think my essential point in response to this question is that we want to open conversations, and the danger with labelling and using a unitary label can close conversations.
And Andrew, that point about opening conversations really goes to some of the points Monica made in her presentation and about the role of education. This might be a good opportunity for us to ask our final poll question, which is a rather open-ended question. But we thought it was important to ask this question because we've lived through these extraordinary times. We've seen that the pandemic has had a negative impact on attitudes in some areas, but perhaps there have been some positive moments as well. So if you can describe a positive interaction, if any, with a person not known to you during the pandemic, let us know on menti.com or in our chat, and we'll record that as part of the discussion. Now I'm going to ask some more questions. This one. Do you believe more attention should be directed towards understanding the behaviour of perpetrators instead of putting on the onus on victims when it comes to discrimination? I think we've discussed this in some ways, but Monica, I'd be interested to hear from you about your work at the Commission, or indeed your work with the police, or in many of the very practical roles you've held. Has this come up as a topic of discussion? How do we understand the behaviour of people who discriminate or appear to be racist, and what do we do about that?
Yeah, there's lots of work in this space happening at the moment, and we hear overwhelmingly that there's, as this person indicated, there's a massive onus on the victim of crimes or the victims of racism to go through the process of reporting their situation, tell us where it's happening, what's happening. It can be really hard to do that sort of work with the perpetrator. They're obviously not one to come to the Commission and express themselves and tell us why they feel certain ways about particular community groups. I also think that it's really hard as well when thinking about perpetrator behaviours to change them necessarily from a Commission standpoint. We do our community education sessions empowering community groups who are vulnerable to racism, but I think the biggest power the Commission has is investigations and holding people to account. So the more people that report complaints of racism, the more we can support them through a dispute resolution process and, as I said, hold people accountable for their actions.
Thanks, Monica. Andrew, would you like to respond to that question? Or?
Not really. I don't think there's much more to add to that, but other than the theme of what we've been really dealing with is we want to get a rounded understanding of phenomena, not just from one perspective, but from different perspectives. And really part of the way of dealing with the problems we face is to better understand and decode the problems and decode their basis. Where is it coming from? Why are you behaving in that way? Obviously, much work is being done in this space, and much more work needs to be done in this space.
Yes, thank you. And I'm going to throw it open to a question that is similar to the last one, but it flips it. And the questioner asks, Monica, this might be again one for you to have a first go at. What would be your suggestions for individuals if he or she experiences racial discrimination at work? Are there a clear 1, 2, or 3 steps?
I don't think so, unfortunately. I think it really depends on the particular circumstance and your comfortability about raising issues. For some, it might be talking directly to your manager about it. Perhaps they're not very aware, either racially or culturally, about sensitivities. So it might be seeking advice from WorkSafe or WorkCover, going to the commission and flagging, I've had this experience, doesn't really sit well with me. Is it discriminatory? If so, how can I obtain support? But I think back to on a personal level, some of my friends and them being very strong advocates for diversity and really not standing for anything less, really, like being treated with respect and dignity in the workplace and escalating it up to management if required. Our leaders like to espouse that they believe in diversity and inclusion and a zero bullying policy in organizations. Well, if situations are happening, depending on the moment, they really should be addressing them and making sure that everybody feels comfortable in the workplace. And what your manager might see as a small issue can be really important to that individual, and not to belittle or consider racial issues in the workplace as a small issue. I think quite often people of colour in the workplace have just told, oh, it's not too bad, deal with it. But we're carrying a lot of emotional labour in the workforce as well. So if you do feel uncomfortable by a situation you've been put in, really do raise it in a manner which you feel is appropriate.
Thanks, Monica. And that's great. And please, people, keep putting in your thoughts into the chat. About the pandemic, positive or negative, or anything else that you want to say. We've got about 7 or 8 minutes more. I'm going to jump in and exercise moderator's prerogative here and ask a question myself. Monica, you used the term systemic racism, and it might be good to unpack this term a little bit, perhaps by looking at one particular field in our society, which is the police. Now, about 14 years ago, there was a lot of evidence of racial profiling in Victoria. I'm talking about Victoria, but I'm sure it happened elsewhere. Racial profiling of young men of African background here in Melbourne. My sense is that there has been quite a bit of progress since then in terms of the police, but you know better than I do. And I'm just wondering what you think about and what you've experienced at the Commission in terms of police here in this state, and whether there has been change, and whether there is a serious effort about addressing issues of racism within the force.
Yeah, so in my previous role, I did work at Victoria Police in their Priority Communities Division department, and that department was established following the court case of Daniel Halmichael and the community members in the Flemington and North Melbourne area. And it led to the commissioning of a report, Equality is Not the Same, which provided the police force with some clear directives and programs and ways forward to address structural and systemic racism within the police force. Some of the work that was implemented was cultural awareness training, starting at recruit level all the way up to a senior sergeant level, having more engagement with community through the proactive policing units, and also just a general education uplift within the force. And I'm pretty sure that that piece of work was over a 5 to 6 year period, and it finished, I think, last year, but don't quote me on that. I think that inevitably there'll always be issues with racism and policing when you do have those structural issues where particularly young Black men, they've got all this luggage to carry, in the sense that they're more likely to be justice involved because perhaps at an education level, they're more likely to be expelled. They're less likely to have jobs because of racial biases and having to change their names. They're more likely to be perceived as criminal based purely on their color and people's perceptions of what it is to be a young Black man and the fears that people have, and also media representations of young Black men. But on the counter, having worked in the police force, I do see the crime statistics. I do see, or I did see, the sorts of offences that were being committed and the real fear and vulnerability victims of crime faced or felt. So I think there'll always be that that struggle between making sure people are treated with dignity and respect, but also being able to respond to crime trends.
Thanks, Monica. That's a great answer. I'm going to take a question that's related to that, just come up. How can we shift the focus of addressing discrimination and racism from the individual to corporations, institutions, systems? It's a natural segue from the previous question, I guess. The questioner believes that the consistent focus on the individual is failing to address underlying issues. So there's quite a bit to unpack there, but I wonder, and I might bring you in as well, Andrew, after Monica's spoken, but is that the way that we go about this? Do you think we need to shift the focus towards institutions and structures? And if that's the case, how do we do that?
I'm happy for Andrew to go first. I've gone first a lot. Gentlemen first.
Andrew, why don't you pick that up?
Yep. I mean, you know, a lot of the discrimination and racism that we're dealing with is on the street. It's person to person. It might be a comment, you know, in a supermarket. So certainly at that level, it is an issue of individual behaviour. It may well be an issue of education and some of these broader issues with regard to the education system, but it's not just going to be about that. It can be often like a case of individual psychology and individual disposition. You know, it may well be that, and I would think that the person who's got problems with issues of people's background and race has also got problems in a whole range of other areas and interpersonal relationships. So at that level, it is about, I think, individuals. And then the way that institutions operate, I think, is another dimension of the problem, and perhaps a sort of different perspective. Monica, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that you've said. I do agree that I think that change does start from an individual level, because individuals run organizations, individuals are business leaders, individuals head up organizations. So if they don't have a positive view or an anti-racist view about how to look at diversity and inclusion through their organizations, what will happen if they don't have that perspective? But I also think that at an institutional level as well, it's about being comfortable with the changing diversity in Australia. Australia fundamentally is a Black country with First Nation people, and now we have a lot of whiteness in our country, but Anglo-Saxon or people of like Anglo-Saxon heritage, they're one of many cultures in our country. So I think it's just being comfortable with the changing face and the changing hue of Australia, really, and making sure that you're comfortable and on that journey and open to making sure that leadership in your organisation is reflective of that changing face of Australia.
Thanks,
James, can I just briefly say, like, with regard to institutions and my experience, and this is in a large institution, a university, but in a university environment, there's zero tolerance for discrimination and racism. And that starts with like training modules, online training modules that people have to take. People have to understand what the terms mean. They'll have to respond yes, no to a whole range of different questions to ensure that they actually do know what's involved. And then there's a clear demarcation of a process that has to be followed. And the first part of that process, and I've been involved in mediation and so on, Monica, I don't know if this is true, rings true for you, is to actually collect evidence. So if you've got perceiving a problem, start to keep a diary. And that can be a very early step. And then if the situation is not managed, they'll be escalating up the chain, but you've actually kept the diary.
I totally agree with you. You have to document everything. We live in a generation where you screen cap everything. If you're experiencing discrimination, make sure you're writing it down, because you really do need that evidence to bring something to management.
It's interesting what you just said, Monica, because one thing we haven't discussed, and we're out of time, unfortunately, is the online environment and how the online environment is contributing to these issues. But I'm going to close with one last question. And Andrew, you've got a fan club in the chat, or someone says we need Andrew to go first one of these times. So I'm going to throw this to Andrew. And the question is there enough data that can help us understand whether discrimination will increase or decrease in 2022? I think that's a good question for us to end on. So let's get a final thought from both of you. Andrew first.
I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not very good at that. I'm more looking in the mirror person. I fervently hope that will be the case. But for me, all of the things that we're talking about are ongoing challenges. Like, for example, social cohesion, which is the central motif of our work. You don't arrive at a situation of a socially cohesive society. It's something that you keep working on and you try and do better at it all the time. And I think all of the conversations we've been having, the central issues: get a perspective, understand what is achievable, and then measure what your progress against the achievable, or what you see as the achievable.
Thanks, Andrew. Monica, can we have a last thought from you, please?
Yeah, I don't have a crystal ball either, but through the Commission's work with our Reducing Racism project, where we're actively encouraging community members to report racism, I do hope we see an increase in the reporting of racism and other forms of discrimination, because, you know, the data that we have is only scratching the surface of the real experiences that everyone has on a day-to-day basis. So I hope that there's no more experiences of discrimination, but I do hope that individuals feel more encouraged and supported to report the experiences that they do have.
Thank you very much, Monica. And just before we close, we've had some really great responses to the question to describe a positive interaction, if any, with a person not known to you during the pandemic. They're on screen now, but clearly there was some upside to COVID as well. And let's hope that upside included people from different backgrounds connecting with each other in their neighbourhood or wherever they met. Look, can I just say, I think it's been a terrific a pair of presentations from you first, Andrew, then you, Monica. I learned so much myself hearing both of you speak. These are difficult questions. It was terrific when you said, Monica, we need to kill them with kindness. You know, I think that's something that, you know, that's not the whole story, but it's part of the story, is having an open, generous mind while not compromising when we see things that are completely unacceptable, you know, in our workplaces or wherever. As Andrew said, zero tolerance of racism anywhere. But at the same time, being open-minded and assuming to people is something that came strongly for me through both your presentations. So thank you very much to both of you. And thank you to the Scanlon Foundation for organising this event. We've been working on this issue for a long time. There are mapping social cohesion reports and data on this going back now to 2007, and we will keep presenting data and evidence and argument around how we build an Australia that is in which everybody gets a chance to thrive and not to be prejudiced and not to be discriminated against in any way on the basis of their skin color or their faith or any other reason. So thanks, Monica. Thank you, Andrew. And remember that you can please go onto social media and publicize this event at hashtag social cohesion, which I put in before. You can access a copy of the 2020 Mapping Social Cohesion Report at scanloninstitute.org.au. There'll be more follow-up events in this series, so please stay in touch, and we hope to see you again soon. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for coming and for contributing so energetically to this great conversation.